Hi there, I'm Ken Cook, and I'm having another episode. They just keep coming, and I want to start this episode by briefly touching on a previous episode I had in 2024 called Endocrine Disruptors and Early Puberty for Girls with a pediatric endocrinologist and clinical investigator named Dr. Natalie Shaw, who's wonderful. In that episode, we talked about something that's been unfolding across the country and around the world for decades. It's girls entering puberty earlier than ever before, earlier than their mothers did, definitely earlier than their grandmothers did. And we've talked about the growing body of evidence pointing to environmental exposures like the chemicals in our food, air, water, personal care products, our homes as some of the key drivers of that shift, which is freaky. It was one of those conversations that I think really stay with a lot of our listeners because it reframes something that might have seemed like just a biological fact of modern life into something that deserves real scrutiny, real concern, and real action. Now, today we're kind of closing the loop because it turns out the same classes of chemicals that may be disrupting the very beginning of the female reproductive lifespan could also be affecting the end of it. And that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. My guest to talk about that today is Dr. Lauren Petrick, a researcher and environmental health scientist at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. She runs the Petrick Lab. You know, when you are a scientist and you have your own lab, that's kind of a thing. And she's at the forefront of two of the most exciting and consequential frontiers in modern environmental health research: exposomics and metabolomics. In plain terms, she and her team have developed the tools and methods to measure not just 5 or 10 chemical exposures in the human body, but potentially hundreds, even thousands, all by drawing from a single small biological sample. Which is to say, they're able to study the world we live in, which is a world of vast mixtures of toxic chemicals that come to us through our air, water, food, personal care products, and so forth. But what brought Dr. Petrick onto my radar most recently, and what I suspect is going to be the topic our listeners are talking about long after this episode ends, is her recently published study entitled Impact of Environmental Exposures on Menopausal Symptoms. It isn't, in many ways, exactly the kind of paper that makes you think, why did it take us so long to ask this question? Is it medical bias, like mainly guys doing the research? Because what Dr. Petrick and her co-authors have done is pull together the available evidence from studies across the field examining how everyday chemical exposures, these will all ring a bell with listeners to this podcast, phthalates, phenols, heavy metals, air pollution, pesticides, are associated with the menopausal experience for women in midlife and beyond. So multiple studies across multiple populations are showing associations between these exposures and a wide range of menopausal symptoms, from the hot flashes most people think of to mood changes, sleep disruption, and beyond. And phthalates, the plasticizers that are frankly everywhere in modern life, from food packaging to personal care products, medical devices, including in all of us, appear to be emerging as a consistent risk factor across all of that evidence. That's not a single study. That's a signal showing up repeatedly in different places with different populations. And that's what makes it matter so much. This is about the plastic container you heated your lunch in. Don't do that. The fragrance in your lotion. Try and avoid it. The air quality in your neighborhood. Call President Trump and tell him to do something about that. These are the textures of everyday life. And what Dr. Petrick's work is beginning to show is that those everyday exposures may be having consequences that we have barely begun to measure, let alone address. So today we're going to walk through the findings of her review, talk about the state of the evidence, what we still don't know, and what Dr. Petrick sees as the most urgent research and policy needs going forward. Because this is not just a scientific question. It's a women's health question. It's a public health question. And frankly, it's long overdue. Dr. Lauren Petrick, welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here with you and to talk about the environment, environmental exposures, the exposome, and we'll talk about how it affects women's health.
Yes, and I have questions coming to you from not just from me but from my wife about that last point. So we'll jump into that. But talk a little bit about your background. You're an analytical chemist by training,
Yeah.
and a lot of analytical chemists go in a very different direction than you went. So maybe that's a place to talk about that, the chemistry interest, and then what was the fork in the road that sent you in the direction you've taken now?
So I've always been interested in analytical chemistry as a tool to really solve puzzles, to quantify things, identify things, asking questions of why and what. And during my PhD, I was interested in the environment. And so I was measuring external environmental exposures, and we would measure indoor air pollution. And at the time, I was looking at third hand smoke and exposures on surfaces. And if we, these third hand smoke chemicals can come off the surfaces and we can be exposed to them. And I really liked what I was doing. But I started to ask the question if whether the things that I was measuring actually affected our health. Because we were measuring because we assumed that they were, but I wasn't actually linking it to health. And that's when my first sort of shift happened, where I started to look at doing really toxicological studies, which means that I was taking some environmental exposures and putting them into cell studies and watching what happens. And that was really exciting. That was sort of my first step to move from analytical chemistry over to start to think about how this affects biology. So
Okay.
I moved from an environmental and civil engineering faculty to the Faculty of Medicine. And
Uh-huh.
that's where I did these first toxicological studies. And then I heard about the exposome. Yeah, and it blew my mind. I was at an
Yeah.
international conference, and I remember hearing about this idea that you don't just measure 5 things or 10 exposures, but could you measure thousands at the
Yeah.
same time? And because we're not exposed to one thing, we're not exposed to 5 things. We're really exposed to thousands of things over the course of our life and even, hundreds of things at the same time.
You were basically interested in the real world, as we like to call it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I saw that
Yeah.
presentation, I said, "Oh my gosh, that's what I wanna do." And so I was honored to be able to start studying the exposome in Steve Rappaport's lab, as a postdoctoral fellow at
Hmm.
UC Berkeley, and he was one of the
Yep.
pioneers of this exposome concept.
Yep.
That was where I started to get into the exposome and trying to understand if we can discover and identify new exposures and biological changes that are linked to later disease, really to try and find not just, diagnose or to treat, but could we prevent, right? Could we start to prevent disease by identifying these
Yeah.
exposures? From there, I then took those tools and opened my lab at Mount Sinai and was able to expand the lab now with multiple high resolution mass spectrometers, an amazing team where our goal is to not only measure more, but can we measure them at lower concentrations? Can we measure them better? Can we measure them across different sample types that traditionally, we were always looking at blood or urine samples? There's a lot of wealth in that, but those are hard to get from everybody and they're hard to get over multiple times. So, can we
Yeah.
measure other sample types that might be able to ask different questions? And so that's where my lab has been going, and we've been doing that to study and understand risk factors associated with cancers and autism and many other different diseases and disorders across the life course.
We'll definitely put a link into your laboratory so people can discover for themselves the breadth of the work and the depth. I was very impressed that as an organization that has practically bled people to death to get samples big enough to look for multiple chemicals. May he rest in peace. Poor Bill Moyers used to say, "How much blood are you going to take from me for this biomonitoring study you're doing?" But he survived that. Now, you're looking at a dried sample of blood or wrist monitors
Yeah.
and pulling incredible information out of it.
Yeah, part of this is realizing also for myself, it's hard for me to get to a clinic's office to get a blood
Yeah.
draw. Some people don't have access, they have busy schedules, many different reasons. And so we've been working on how we can get these collections into the home so that people can do them with,
Yeah.
minimally invasive with a single droplet onto either a piece of paper or other devices, or we can just wear a passive sampler on your wrist. You can just put it on, wear it for 7 days, and we can capture exposures. And this really allows us to think about certain timeframes that people might be interested, or how they can effectively look at either, times during pregnancy where it might be even more challenging to get sort of multiple
Yeah,
measures, or look at children. We don't want to have our children get a blood draw. I wouldn't want my children to get a blood draw.
exactly. Yeah.
So, or we can put wristbands on teenagers, right? Teenagers really hate to do any sort of exposure studies, but we can use wristbands and get broad measurements across 20 classes of chemicals in a single measurement and a single sample.
I have so many questions for you. I have so many areas that I want to share with our audience of your work. But let me just start with, where does metabolomics come in to your work? We've got the exposome, but
Yeah.
now explain about that frontier. And I'm describing these as frontiers. I'm not saying you're the only person doing it, but you're doing vanguard work in all of these places that you're touching. And the gap between what you're doing and what science is revealing to us about the links between our environment and health is miles ahead of where we are with respect to policy and regulation at this point.
Yeah.
This is the groundwork for what at least I hope one day will more thoroughly inform how we deal with environmental contaminants, because my working belief is that we now have a system where we basically say, as long as it's legal or de minimis or we don't know what it is, there is literally no limit to the number of things we can add to human beings from industrial sources. No limit.
Right.
And so, that's a big problem to take on. So how does metabolomics fit into that?
Yeah. So I kind of think about metabolomics as a measurement of what is happening in your body right now. And when we think about exposomics, we're thinking about, well, how did it get there, right? Can we measure environmental exposures that are going to help us understand how those biological changes occurred? The tool is very similar, right? We still use these high resolution mass spectrometers. And what they do is they actually measure these thousands of signals. And the instrument can't tell and doesn't care whether that thing that you're measuring is an environmental exposure or a metabolite that's circulating already, a natural metabolite. So
Yeah.
the instrument's measuring it the same, right? It's just the interpreter and how you alter your parameters to be able to cover this whole range. And so we've developed our methods on these instruments so that we can capture both at the same time. And that allows us to get those environmental exposure measures. We're not looking at just 5 or 10, but we're trying to measure hundreds and discover new ones even.
Yeah.
And to measure those endogenous metabolites so we can understand exposure and the biology that could be associated with it in the same test. In the same small, 50 microliter sample, we can do both.
So amazing. It speeds up the inquiry and the knowledge accumulation so dramatically to not have to rely on those older, more difficult means. What kinds of exposomic signals have you looked at? It's everything. It's everyday life. I mean, you seem to be looking at such a wide range of exposure events and looking at it, at environmentally relevant levels.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What we do are epidemiological studies, right? So we're taking general population, free living individuals, and we're measuring their exposures and trying to link those to different health outcomes depending on the population that we're looking at. So these are real exposures. These are the circulating chemicals that are in their bodies or that are being absorbed to the wristbands. One of the classes of chemicals I think that has a lot of interest right now is the PFAS chemicals, right? These are per and
Yeah.
polyfluorinated alkyl substances. And we know that there's 10,000s of them that are
Yeah.
being produced. And in a normal biomonitoring, what we typically measure, we're measuring, 20
Yeah.
of those that are, and that's, what has been traditionally measured. But with these platforms that are in my laboratory, we can measure those 20, and we can also discover novel fluorinated compounds, and novel potential PFAS chemicals. And we're starting to see new ones that we're seeing associated with some of the different health outcomes. And we're trying to dig in to see what these PFAS are. And maybe we should be looking at them more broadly as well. So, in a typical measurement of a population, we'll measure those probably about 10 or 12 of those sort of traditional PFAS chemicals like PFOS and PFOA, which people are always measuring, and PFHXS. But we'll measure maybe 40 other potential fluorinated and PFAS chemicals that aren't characterized, that aren't normally looked at, that we can see associations with some of these health outcomes. So I think this gives us a way to validate some of the findings that have been done from these traditional approaches, but also really be on the cutting edge of what we're exposed to, because the chemical companies, right, they're required to monitor only a certain handful.
Yeah.
And at the same time these chemicals are being produced, there's also a lot of these other side chemicals that are being put in our water and put in our soil, and we're not monitoring them at all. So these instruments and these assays give us an opportunity to see what they are and if they have potential health effects.
So, at the risk of nerding out and losing people in the audience, but I think this will be, I like to think this will be as interesting to them as it is to me. But talk us through how you go from the presence of that, finding that in a epidemiologically derived sample from regular people who might use personal care products,
Mhm.
might eat food,
Yeah.
who knew, might drink water, other dangerous activities.
Floss their teeth.
Fresh, yeah, flush. Oh, please, that one killed me. And I thought, we've been doing PFAS, PFOA, everything since the early 2000s. And as I tell people, I am always surprised by the next application of it that shows up in the world. But anyway, so how do you begin to understand how that might affect? I guess at the cellular level, you want to understand it first. And then
Mhm.
from there, it's a question of further research needed to demonstrate all the way down the road to maybe a health effect. But what's that first key step?
Yeah. So if there's a population and we don't think about it in terms of like their health outcomes, right? We're just
Right.
taking a population and we want to just look at, we do a screening for their exposures and then we do a screening for their biology, all in the same assay, right?
Okay.
We inject the sample into the instrument and it measures all of these signals, right? And the
Okay.
first thing we do is identify all of those signals. And so we'll identify a whole bunch of PFAS, right? Like you mentioned. And then we also can link a lot of these signals to metabolites.
The breakdown products of the chemical that you're looking at.
So there can be those, and there can be
Yeah.
endogenous metabolites, right, to understand the
Uh-huh.
biology, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, phthalates, we'll see not only the parent phthalate, but we'll see also the biological metabolites of that environmental exposure of those phthalates, right?
The whole happy family. There they are.
Right.
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah.
see those. And then we'll see things like amino acids, and we'll see tyrosine, we'll see linoleic acid, we'll measure DHA, right? These are all metabolites that we think of when you go get a normal blood screen or when you think about food and nutrition
Yeah.
metabolites and things that are good for our bodies, right?
Yeah.
What we can do is link these environmental exposures through statistics to changes in levels of these different metabolites that are linked to biological pathways. And so we can say, okay, this exposure to this one PFAS chemical, for example, PFHXS, right, is associated with all of these changes in oxidized lipids, right, which suggests some lipid oxidation pathways are being interrupted. Or we can see that this chemical is statistically associated with changes in the levels of amino acids, right? And so you can start to understand just on a general level, and not how it links
Yeah.
down to further health outcomes, but how these chemicals are possibly related to changes in our different biological mechanisms that are happening or dysregulating them.
I think of the hallmarks of cancer, the pathways there, those kinds of insights. I presume down the road, the linkage would begin to come together with additional research. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. So then we can link those changes from the environmental exposures to changes in pathways that might be linked with inflammation to cancer outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Or we can link the exposures to the cancer outcome and then understand the biology between them, right? We can work in different directions, putting
Yeah.
those sort of three corners together.
Amazing. Amazing. So a while back, Linda Birnbaum came on the program and I asked her at one point, and I'll ask you the same question. What surprised you the most? What was the sort of discovery about environmental health or environmental toxicology or however you want to characterize the field? And she said endocrine disrupting chemicals. You only get to pick one. What would be the thing that really kind of blew your mind?
Oh, I don't know if there's one one chemical, right? That has
Right.
blown my
Yeah.
mind. I think the literature that has come out recently that really points to the fact that the exposome is a much bigger contributor to most disease
Yeah.
has been really flooring me compared to sort of the typical age and non-genetic factors. So this is really exciting in terms of the research that needs to happen and moving this forward.
You picked a good one. It is mind blowing to think about the exposome in that way. And you're right at the cutting edge of it. So now I'm going to get to my wife's question now. And it's a question with a little bit of attitude, which is okay, we've studied early life and we know the effect that some of these chemicals can have on reproductive success, reproductive health generally, and so forth.
Mhm.
And we've studied that in early life, probably belatedly in the case of women. And that's her attitude right there, I'll just tell you. But when I showed her your paper, your latest paper looking at perimenopause and menopause and mid and later in life impacts on women and their reproductive health. And she said, well, that makes all the sense in the world. But, why has it taken us so long to even study it? So you can editorialize here. I'm a guy, but I was raised by two women, and so I'm ready to be on the receiving end of duh.
I have to agree with her in the sense that I mean, I could tell you the challenges, right, of why this has taken quite a long time.
Tell us.
Okay.
Don't skip that part. Don't skip that part.
Okay, so I think, if we talk about menopause symptoms specifically, one of the main challenges is that there's no defined menopause syndrome, right? The symptoms range so broadly from the typical, which everyone thinks of as like a hot flash, right?
Right.
To mood, to itchy skin, to anxiety, right? There's just such a broad range, and there's no universally defined menopause syndrome.
Well, if guys experience those things, we'd know all about it by now.
I
But go ahead.
agree.
Yeah.
But right now, there is not. And so that makes it
Right.
hard to study associations with an outcome that is not clearly
Yeah.
defined, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
one of them. One of the other reasons is really it's just been taboo. We have not been talking about menopause just until the last 5 years. This has become mainstream, and we can talk about it and have honest scientific and intellectual, normal, everyday conversations about menopause. And so just bringing it to the forefront,
Yeah.
there's lots of cultural differences, right? It's a lived experience, and how you experience menopause symptoms it's subjective, and that makes it hard to study.
Yeah.
And I think the last reason why we haven't studied is that we know that physicians aren't trained in menopause. And so if you go to a gynecologist, for your regular visit, this is not something they've received training on, and so it's not something that is really talked about. So I think
Yeah.
those things have really limited our ability until recently to be able to really study this as a health outcome.
Yeah. I was struck by thematically how it read a lot like how the discovery or the understanding of early onset puberty finally broke through after years of debate. Is that a fair comparison or metaphor or whatever?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, this is really how I started to become interested in this. I think I had a very similar sort of aha moment to what you described as your wife having, which is like, duh, right? Like, so
Yeah.
I I was
Yeah.
sitting there noticing for myself that something was going on when I hit 40, and I said, something's weird.
Yeah.
And I realized I
Yeah.
was probably entering perimenopause. I went right into the science rabbit hole and started to understand what is happening. And as I was reading,
As one does.
as one does, and I started just reading about what's happening biologically, right? And it parallels exactly to what's happening in early life and in puberty. You have these huge biological shifts, you have these huge shifts in hormones. And we know that those things, when they're happening in puberty and prenatally and in early life, those are windows of susceptibility to environmental exposures, right? Because these environmental
Yeah.
exposures, which a lot of them are endocrine disrupting chemicals, right? Or they
Yes.
induce inflammation or oxidative stress at these times. Prenatally, we know that if there's exposures to phthalates and parabens, They shift the programming for puberty, and you see later or earlier different changes in the timelines of puberty outcomes. So we have those things happening, and they've been established early life, puberty,
Yeah.
that are these windows of susceptibility. So doesn't it make sense that menopause is a window of susceptibility?
Yeah.
Biologically,
Yeah.
it made sense. In terms of what we understand about environmental exposures, it makes sense. And now it's starting to put the literature together to show for some cases there's data that's supporting it. So I think this is important to continue looking into.
Yeah. And so we have early onset puberty where, girls are entering puberty at earlier and earlier ages. There are some who are entering puberty very much earlier than we had suspected before. And those were some of the early indicators that something was going on, and the environment it's not the only, but it's one of the main things people are investigating and concerned about. What's the situation with menopause? Are women entering menopause or perimenopause earlier? What are some of the other biological developments that you think might be associated with environmental exposures?
So there are some papers that have shown associations with shifts in the onset of menopause. In some cases, it could be earlier. In some cases, it could be later. I think menopause onset is a tricky thing to measure because you don't
Hmm.
actually know that you entered menopause until 12 months after you entered menopause. It's 12 months after your last menstrual
Right.
period, you can say, okay, I entered menopause. It's a hard thing to measure. And I don't
Yeah.
think that we have good data. Right now, the data doesn't suggest that there's a sort of global shift towards
Right.
earlier or late menopause that you see in some other diseases when you see, okay, we see increasing prevalence of early onset cancer. And so we think that there's this link to environment. We're not seeing that
Right.
with menopause
Right.
yet, but I don't know whether that is because the measurements aren't there. They're not done good enough for us to see, or
Okay.
if the onset of menopause as a time point is the end all be all, right? There could be other outcomes. We do see consistent associations between phthalate exposure and decreased levels of some of the biomarkers linked with ovarian aging. So seems to be consistent.
Say a bit about ovarian aging and why that's so important.
So there's two main biomarkers of ovarian aging. One is AMH, which is anti-Müllerian hormone, and it measures basically the functional ovarian reserve. It's a hormone that you can measure in the blood. Basically, it peaks when you're up to about 25 or 26, and then it slowly declines. And as you get closer to menopause, it declines even faster until it becomes undetectable levels, and it's released from the ovary. There's another one called antral follicle count, which is similar. It also measures ovarian reserve, but you need to measure it using a vaginal ultrasound. And so that's much harder to measure. So there's not as much data on that. But the studies have shown is that exposures to higher levels of phthalates are one of the compounds. They're seeing lower levels of AMH and AFC. And that's seen in multiple different studies in multiple different cohorts. So you're seeing sort of consistent associations with that. So that suggests that the sort of reproductive duration of the female reproductive system of the ovaries may be shortening, right? And that
Yeah.
could have implications for onset of menopause and all of the downstream pathologies that are associated with that, right? Like increased cognitive decline, decreased bone strength, and all of the things that are linked with earlier onset of menopause.
Yeah. When I bring up topics like this, I don't know about you, but my dinner invitations have really fallen off sharply because either people think I'm going to take a urine sample, or I don't know what they think, but they're very careful what they eat around me and what they serve it in and so forth. But to go back to the start of our conversation, the wide array of chemical exposures, and as you've just described, there's evidence for one sort of family of phthalates. These are chemicals that are commonly found as plasticizers and other
Mhm.
purposes. They've been in cosmetics for years and so forth. It can seem overwhelming to people. How do you process it? I know what keeps you going is you have an intense scientific interest, but when you step back from the science, do you have these holy shit moments? What are we doing?
um,
That's an EWG
yeah,
technical term. Yeah.
good. I'm going to use it from now on. But so I do think that it can be incredibly overwhelming. because we can't stop it. It's not that we can have no exposures. We live, we have
Yeah.
to live, we keep living, right? We do the best to protect our children. We can't go crazy, right? I know when my children were born, my husband was not so thrilled about it, but I was like, we need organic mattresses. We need to get a, I was really into that at the time. And he's like, are you kidding me? Like, what? These debates that are happening at home to
Yeah.
try to reduce our exposures.
Yeah.
In the end, I think we compromise on some sort of, covering. We do what we can. And there are certain things that you can do that we know are sort of easy fixes to reduce some of your exposures, depending on the types of chemicals like phthalates. I think it's pretty well known that we don't take plastic containers and heat our food in the microwave or in the oven, right? Because that'll leach out a lot of plastics. That's a simple thing. We could transfer it to glass and put it in our microwave, right? To try to
Right. Yeah.
reduce exposures. Going fragrance free is a good way to reduce exposures. And EWG has fantastic information on the website on products people can choose and ways that they can reduce different exposures. So at sometimes I have to put blinders on, right? Because
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
to keep living, we have to keep enjoying life. I don't want to ever not go out to eat or enjoy,
Right.
the things
Of
around me.
course.
And I do love a good, slice of pizza on a piece of wax paper like
Yes.
everyone else
Yes.
off the street,
Yes.
you know?
I confess. I'm right with
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
So, we have to just do the best that we can do and try to make the best choices we can given what's available to us. I know there's a lot of places you can't get organic food.
Or can't afford it. A lot of people can't afford it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think everyone's just trying to do the best that they can to reduce exposures. And we just keep trying to do the science to learn as much as we can. And I think this exposome concept right now, which is really on a kick to really measure many, many more at the same time. I'm really excited about the promise of how we can think of these in the context of really living, right? And what are going to
Yeah.
be the priority chemicals that we're going to focus on,
Yeah.
whether that's because of where you live or the dishware that you use or other items, to be able to zero in and hopefully affect policy that's going to help not only put all the burden on the individual to decide, but
Right.
also,
Right.
right, to have some legislation in place to help everyone. I'm optimistic, and at the same time I put blinders on. So I don't I don't know
Yeah.
what that says.
I have that same split when we were having our little boy who's now 18. And I found myself resenting going to these online databases to see what I should buy and not buy. And they were my databases. So it's so important to keep people feeling empowered, give them choices. You can reduce lots of exposures without dramatic changes in your lifestyle. But the question that keeps rising up in my mind is, when are we going to find traction and find the right models to bring the economy along with what science like your science and colleagues across the world are discovering, which is, we probably would be better off with a simpler exposome. We'd probably, if we could, we'd probably be better off understanding or beginning to understand what mixtures of these chemicals might do. We'd probably be better off if we did reduce exposures, because we're not using risk assessments to eliminate these things very quickly, right?
Right.
And now, we're, in some ways we might even be going backwards. So that to me is the mood swing that I go through. But when I talk to scientists like you, I have to say, you're really digging in and trying to understand these real world exposures, what they might mean, and consumers can make something of that. I think that's important, as you point out. I think first industry has to kind of come around to a different understanding
Yeah.
that we're not depositories, we're human beings,
Yeah.
that there's something to be said for, conserving our biological potential, and we wouldn't want that to be compromised by someone's cleaning ingredient or
Yeah.
floss, right?
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of choices that I don't know if they're not even choices. I think about things like I have my daughter's a preteen, and she's following all the stuff on the internet and sees all these.
TikTok.
Yes,
She's
I
on
know, and
TikTok.
she's seeing all these
Yes.
products and endless products and facial creams and I'm feeling her desire to be a teenager and want fragrances and all of this
Yes.
excitement, and I'm being torn with knowing these probably aren't very good for her, and
Yeah.
doing that balance, and it's unfair. It is unfair. It's unfair for her. It's unfair for me that we have to, you know, struggle like this. So ultimately, I agree with you. If we can get these manufacturers to make these choices, if it's economical for them, and we're in a
Yeah.
system that promotes that in some way.
Rewards them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when you look at the progress that's been made, where do you think the discovery path will take us in the foreseeable future, say the next 5 or 10 years? What are we going to be likely learning?
Oh, I think that the lamppost is going to be spreading. I think that in
Oh,
terms of
what a
the
great
class
metaphor.
of the chemicals that we're looking at, we're going to see that it's bigger than what we've been looking at before. There's co-exposures that are happening that we're not tracking, and some of those co-exposures may be worse in terms of health effects than what we've been studying, or what's coming out. That's probably where, these technologies are allowing us to find.
Well, it's refreshing to study the real world instead of one chemical at a time and one health effect at a time. And what you're doing is stepping back from that model, which is what guides our regulatory system now, to try and see how we might improve it and have a better understanding of what we're really doing to ourselves. And thank you for joining today. And I'll keep reading. And the next time you have another amazing study like your review of what's going on with menopausal women and environmental exposures, I'll ring you up again if I can, because I love learning from you.
Absolutely. This was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. This has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. So thank you for having me here.
Keep at it, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links to take a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head on over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if this episode resonated with you or you think someone you know would benefit from it, please send it along. The best way to make positive change is to start as a community with your community. Today's episode was produced by the extraordinary Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby. Thank you, Moby. And thanks again to all of you for listening.